The humming began as a rumor on the wind, a vibration felt in the teeth before it was heard. From the west, it resolved into a haze, a greasy, green-tinged smear against the hard blue of the August sky. An army of aphids, numberless as sand, riding the hot currents toward the valley's promise of 1,000 acres of sweet, ripening corn. On Jedediah Thorne's land, the wave hit first. Men shouted and ran for smudge pots, their movements frantic and useless. The corn leaves, which had been praying hands that morning, curled into fists, then blackened. The sound was a soft, insidious chewing, the collective noise of a million tiny mouths. The cloud rolled on, a slow-motion catastrophe, from Thorne's fields to the Miller brothers, then to the widow Jensen's meager patch. At the edge of Elspeth's farm, they paused. Jedediah Thorne and half a dozen other men stood there, their faces grimed with smoke and despair, watching. They had come not to help but to witness the final, predictable failure of the woman they called the Sun Witch. Her corn was planted in a pattern that had been the joke of the county since spring. 4 rows of corn, then a tall, garish row of sunflowers, repeated over and over. A fool's quilt. The aphid cloud, that living plague, hesitated at the wall of bright yellow flowers. It swirled, thickened, and then descended, not on the corn, but onto the broad, coarse leaves and heavy heads of the sunflowers. The green tide vanished into the yellow, and then a second miracle, quieter than the first. From the undersides of those same sunflower leaves, a hidden army emerged. A tide of crimson and black, of ladybugs by the 10,000, waking to the feast laid upon their doorstep. The sunflowers became a killing field. The corn, nestled safely in its green corridors, remained untouched. Elspeth stood on her porch, not moving. She held a single, smooth stone in her hand, her knuckles white. She did not look at the men. She looked at the humming, ravenous salvation in her fields. Thorne took a stumbling step forward, his face a mask of disbelief. "How?" he breathed, the words swallowed by the immense, terrible quiet of his own ruined hopes. It was not a question for her, but for God. 3 months earlier, the silence in the house had been a different kind. It was the hollowed-out silence left by her father's passing, a quiet so total it seemed to have weight and texture. Elspeth moved through it, sorting the meager artifacts of a life spent observing more than participating. He had left her the farm, 80 acres of bottomland that the creek ignored in dry years and flooded in wet ones. He had also left her his journals. They were thick, leather-bound ledgers filled with a cramped, meticulous script. For a week, she read. He had not written of feelings or memories, but of the land itself. He wrote of the minute-by-minute wars and alliances fought in the soil and on the stalks. He chronicled the travels of the squash beetle, the preferences of the lacewing, the exact angle of the sun that brought forth the most rust on the beans. And he wrote, page after page, about sunflowers. To everyone else, they were a weed, a volunteer pest whose deep taproot stole water. To her father, they were a guardian. They are a trap, he wrote. The aphids love them best. They will die on the flower to spare the grain. But the flower needs a friend, a defender. The next morning, Elspeth hitched the old mule to the wagon and drove into town. At Gable's Mercantile, she walked past the barrels of seed corn and oats and stopped before the novelty packets of flower seeds. "Mr. Gable," she said, her voice steady. "I need sunflower seeds." Lemuel Gable, a man whose apron was permanently dusted with flour and judgment, polished a pair of spectacles. "For the garden plot, Elspeth? A little color by the porch is a fine thing for a woman in your position." "No," she said. "For the fields. I need 50 pounds." The store went quiet. Jedediah Thorne, there for a new harness strap, let out a short, sharp laugh. 50 pounds? Girl, are you planting a bird sanctuary?" "I'm planting them with the corn," she said, meeting his gaze. The laughter spread. It was not cruel, not yet. It was the easy, thoughtless mockery reserved for the harmlessly mad. "Now, Elspeth," Gable said, his tone shifting to one of oily concern. "Your father, bless his soul, had his notions. But you're a young woman alone. You can't afford to be playing games with your crop. That land requires a firm hand, not a flower pot." 50 pounds, she repeated, her voice a shade quieter, a shade harder. As Gable reluctantly weighed out the black and white seeds, a woman stepped out of the shadows near the back of the store. It was Anya Petrova, who lived on a small, immaculate plot up the creek. She was old, her face a roadmap of a country no one else had ever visited, and she smelled of dill and damp earth. She said nothing, but her eyes, dark and bright as a bird's, followed Elspeth. Outside, as Elspeth loaded the heavy sack, Mrs. Petrova laid a gnarled hand on her arm. Her touch was surprisingly strong. "The land has many hungers," the old woman said, her accent thick as honey. "You must feed them all, not just your own." Elspeth stared, unsure how to reply. Mrs. Petrova pressed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle into her hand. It was cool and vibrated with a faint, internal life. "For your yellow flowers," she said. "They will need friends." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Elspeth holding what felt like a secret. The work was a prayer spoken with the body. Before the sun had burned the mist off the creek, Elspeth was in the fields. The earth was stubborn, a mix of clay and stone that fought the plow. Her hands, soft from years of keeping house for her father, blistered on the first day, bled on the second, and by the end of the week were turning into something tougher, more like bark. She followed the lines her father had laid out, turning the soil, but she did not plant as the others did. The arithmetic of the valley was simple: corn, row on row, a monoculture of green soldiers marching toward profit. Her arithmetic was different. She measured 4 rows for corn, then left a 5th empty. Day after day, she worked this strange pattern into the face of her 80 acres. The mule, Joshua, was her only companion, his grunts and sighs a steady rhythm against the scrape of the plowshare. The town watched. They had a new pastime. Wagons heading to market would slow as they passed her property. Men would rein in their horses, lean on their fences, and point. The whispers followed her into town like a cloud of gnats. "It's the grief," some said, with a shake of their heads. "Drove her clean out of her senses, her father's madness. Come home to roost," said others. Jedediah Thorne was the loudest. His own fields, bordering hers, were a model of rigid efficiency, his furrows ruler straight, his planting schedule timed to the almanac. He saw her work as a personal affront, an insult to the hard-won wisdom of generations. "She's planting poverty," he declared at the mercantile, to appreciative nods. "Letting weeds take the best row out of every 5. She'll be begging for scraps by winter." She heard it all. She heard it in the way Mr. Gable's smile became a little too placid, in the way other women pulled their children a little closer when she passed. She met the mockery with stillness. To argue was to grant their judgment weight. Her reply was the sun on her back, the ache in her shoulders, the methodical planting of the seed. Corn, 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 corn. Then, the sunflowers. She walked the empty rows with the heavy sack slung over her shoulder, her hand dipping and casting the striped seeds into the furrow. She could feel the town's eyes on her, a physical pressure. She did not look up. She focused on the earth, on the promise held within each small, sharp-shelled seed. A boy began to appear at the edge of her property. He was small for his age, with quiet eyes that missed nothing. It was Finn, Thorne's youngest son. Unlike his father, he didn't mock. He just watched, his chin resting on the top rail of the fence, for hours at a time. One afternoon, she straightened up, her back screaming, and saw him there. "What is it?" she asked, her voice rough from disuse. He flinched, not used to being addressed. "Why are you doing that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It's an idea," she said, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty wrist. "To see if it works." He seemed to consider this. "My pa says it's foolishness, maybe," she said, and went back to her work. Being right, she was learning, was a quiet thing. It didn't need an audience. It just needed time. By June, the farm was a spectacle. The corn had come up strong, but it was the other rows that drew the eye. The sunflowers had exploded from the soil, their thick, hairy stalks already waist-high, their leaves broad and rough as a cat's tongue. The pattern was no longer a network of furrows but a living design, stripes of vibrant green and darker, wilder green. Elspeth's field looked like no other field in the county, or perhaps the whole state. It looked like a child's drawing of a farm, full of exuberant, undisciplined life. The laughter in town had solidified into a kind of pitying folklore. Her farm was now Elspeth's Folly, or the Sun Garden. The name held the gentle contempt people reserve for things they cannot understand. She ignored it. She was too busy. The work had a new rhythm now. It was the rhythm of growth. She walked the rows each morning, her bare feet learning the language of the soil. She checked for cutworms, measured the rainfall in a tin can, and watched the sky. The sunflowers were a world unto themselves. Their broad leaves created corridors of cooler, damper air for the corn, shading the soil and preserving the dew long after the sun had risen. The corn stalks in the adjacent rows seemed to stand up straighter, their green a deeper, more confident shade. She remembered the bundle Mrs. Petrova had given her. One evening, as the light turned to gold, she unwrapped the cloth. Inside were hundreds of tiny, papery cocoons, like grains of brown rice. Ladybug larvae. She went to Finn, who was at his usual post by the fence. She held out the cloth. "Want to help?" she asked. His eyes widened. Together, they walked the sunflower rows, and she showed him how to gently place the cocoons on the underside of the big leaves, where they would be safe. He was impossibly gentle, his small fingers placing the tiny burdens as if they were jewels. "What are they for?" he asked. "They're friends," Elspeth said, echoing Mrs. Petrova. For the flowers from that day on, Finn was no longer a spectator. He became her shadow. He'd slip away from his own family's chores to help her, his father's disapproving shouts fading behind him. He helped her weed and haul water from the creek. He was a quiet, tireless worker, and his presence eased the crushing loneliness she hadn't allowed herself to name. He would ask questions, endless questions, not about why she did it, but how. How deep does the taproot go? Why does this bug have spots? Do sunflowers watch the sun all day? She answered him plainly, sharing the things she'd learned from her father's journals and her own observations. She was teaching him to see the world as she was learning to see it, not as a set of rules to be followed, but as a web of connections to be understood. One afternoon, they were watching the first ladybugs emerge, tiny armored jewels crawling onto the leaves. Finn laughed, a rare, bright sound. "They look hungry," he said. "They are," Elspeth replied, a flicker of something. Not yet hope, but its cousin, possibility, stirring in her chest. They're waiting for dinner. By the end of July, the sunflowers were taller than a man on horseback, a dense rampart of green stalks and leaves, crowned with heavy, drooping heads that turned to follow the sun in a slow, collective worship. The air above her fields was alive. While the other farms in the valley were quiet seas of green, hers was a riot of sound and motion. Bees, wasps, and 100 other kinds of pollinators swarmed the giant yellow blossoms. The buzzing was a constant, low thrum, the sound of furious, joyful industry. The corn, which should have been stunted by the competition, was thriving. The cobs were filling out early, the kernels plump and milky, protected from the worst of the sun's glare in the humid corridors between the flowers. She kept her secret banked low, like a coal under ash. She knew, with a certainty that was growing in her bones, that her father had been right. She was not just growing corn, she was cultivating an ecosystem. She had fed the land's other hungers, and it was rewarding her. The first outsider to see it was not a farmer, but a man of commerce. Mr. Brand, a grain agent from a city cooperative, arrived in the valley in a polished black buggy, his suit unwrinkled by the dust and heat. He was making the rounds, assessing the coming harvest and signing contracts. He was a man who saw fields not as living things, but as assets on a ledger. He moved with a smooth, predatory confidence, his smile a tool he used to put people at ease while he calculated their desperation. He drove past the Thorn place, nodding appreciatively at the uniform rows. He stopped at Elspeth's farm, and his smile faltered. He got out of his buggy and stared, his face a perfect picture of condescending bafflement. "Good day, miss," he said, approaching Elspeth where she was mending a fence. He tipped his hat, but his eyes were cataloging the chaos of her fields. "I am Mr. Brand, with the Northern Plains Cooperative, Elspeth Thorne," she said, not offering her hand. "I've been viewing the crops in this valley," he began, gesturing vaguely toward her field. "And I must confess, I have never seen an arrangement quite like this. It is decorative." The insult was cloaked in politeness. "It's a method," she said simply. He laughed, a soft, patronizing chuckle. "My dear woman, agriculture is a science. There are proven ways, optimized for yield. A young woman alone, with all due respect, could not be expected to grasp the complexities. This is gardening," He walked to the edge of the corn, pulled back a husk, and frowned. The ear was surprisingly full. He quickly covered it, his expression unreadable for a second before the smooth mask returned. "The market is strong this year," he said, his tone shifting. "But a crop like this, with its irregularities, it's a risk. The harvest will be inefficient. I could offer you a contract, of course, as a courtesy, but it would have to be at a significant discount. Say, 60 cents on the dollar. To account for the trouble, it was a predator's offer, designed to exploit her perceived ignorance and isolation. One woman alone. The phrase echoed in her mind. "I'm not ready to sign any contracts, Mr. Brand," she said, her voice even. "I'll wait for the harvest." He looked genuinely surprised, then annoyed. That would be unwise. An offer like this won't stand for long. He tipped his hat again, the gesture now sharp and dismissive. "As you wish." He climbed back into his buggy and drove away, leaving a trail of dust and condescension. Elspeth watched him go, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. He had seen the corn. He had seen it was good, and he had tried to steal it from her. The fight, she realized, was just beginning. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sky bleached to a pale, hazy white, and the sun beat down with a physical weight. The creek, which had been a healthy artery for the valley, began to shrink, its voice lowering from a murmur to a whisper. Rocks that had been submerged for years emerged like the bleached bones of forgotten beasts. The farmers started to worry. They gathered at the mercantile in the evenings, their talk turning from prices and politics to the ominous clarity of the stars at night and the dryness of the dust on the roads. They were men who understood the language of drought. They looked at their vast, uniform fields of corn, all the same age, all needing water at the same time, and a quiet anxiety began to thread through their usual confidence. Jedediah Thorne, whose confidence was the loudest, scoffed at the worriers. "It's a dry spell. It'll break. This land always provides if you work it right." But his eyes, too, scanned the cloudless horizon. Elspeth felt the change not as anxiety, but as a sharpening of her senses. She had been preparing for it without knowing. Her father's journals were full of weather lore, of the signs of a coming dry spell. The way the ants built their hills higher, the way the evening birds flew low. She walked her own land with a new purpose. The sunflowers, with their deep taproots, were drawing moisture from far below the surface, moisture the corn could never reach. The broad leaves that created a humid microclimate during the day now collected heavy dew in the cool of the night, dripping it onto the soil below. Her field was creating its own weather. She did her arithmetic in the dark, sitting on the porch steps. Not the arithmetic of dollars and cents, but of survival. The number of days without rain, the level of the water in her well, the number of ladybugs on a single sunflower leaf. She counted her assets, and they were not the ones Mr. Gable or Mr. Brand would have recognized. They were the bees, the ladybugs, the deep roots, the shade, the dew. She had Finn, and she had the wisdom in her father's books. Mrs. Petrova came to visit one afternoon, carrying a small jar of pickled beets. She didn't look at the corn. She looked at the sky. She crumbled a bit of soil from the sunflower row between her fingers. "The earth is thirsty," she said. "But your land, it has a deep cup to drink from." She looked at Elspeth, her dark eyes searching. "The others, they have only a shallow plate." It was a warning. That evening, Finn arrived, his face troubled. "My pa, he's angry all the time," he said, kicking at a loose stone. "He says the corn is starting to curl. He says if it don't rain by week's end, we'll lose half the crop." Elspeth put a hand on his small shoulder. "Your pa is a proud man, Finn. It's hard for a proud man to admit the weather is stronger than he is." She looked out over her own field, a patchwork of defiant life in the parched landscape. The sunflowers stood like sentinels, their heads heavy and bowed, as if in prayer. The corn beside them was lush and green. It was a terrible and beautiful thing, to be right when everyone else was wrong. It was a lonely kind of wealth, and she had a growing feeling that the drought was not the only test that was coming. The humming began as a rumor on the wind. It was a different sound from the bees. It was higher, thinner, a needle-sharp vibration that spoke of hunger, not industry. Elspeth heard it first, 2 days after Mrs. Petrova's visit. She was at the western edge of her property, and she felt the change in the air before she saw it. She climbed onto the fence, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A green-gray mist was rolling over the low hills to the west. It moved with a slow, inexorable purpose. It was not mist. It was a cloud of living things. Aphids. Her father had written of them. He called them the green scourge, the sapsuckers, the wind riders. They came on the heels of a drought, when plants were stressed and vulnerable. They were a plague of whispers, draining the life from a field not with a roar, but with a billion silent sips. She ran, not toward her house, but toward the creek, toward Thorn's land. She found him standing at the edge of his prize field, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was staring at the approaching haze, his face pale beneath his tan. Aphids, he said, his voice a choked rasp. It was the confirmation of every farmer's worst nightmare. The cloud hit his westernmost rose first. The sound was not a sound at all at first, just a sudden deadening of the air, as if a blanket had been thrown over the world. Then came the soft, sickening rustle. The corn leaves, already curling from the drought, seemed to shiver. A fine green dust settled over everything. Within minutes, the vibrant green began to dull, to yellow, to blacken. The plague was efficient, merciless. Thorn let out a strangled cry and began running, shouting for his farmhands, for smudge pots, for anything. But it was like trying to fight a flood with a teacup. Men ran, smoke billowed, but the green tide rolled on, unstoppable. Elspeth didn't stay to watch. She ran back to her own land, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the test. Everything, her father's scribbled theories, Mrs. Petrova's gift, her summer of back-breaking labor and ridicule, it all came down to this. She reached her fence line just as the first wave of aphids arrived. The air grew thick and heavy, and the humming filled her ears. Finn was there, huddled by the gate, his face terrified. She pulled him close. "Watch," she whispered, her voice tight. "Just watch." The aphid swarm, which had been a uniform, rolling carpet over Thorn's land, seemed to fracture as it reached her field. It hit the first row of sunflowers and broke apart like a wave against a seawall. The insects, programmed by millennia of instinct, were drawn to the broad, succulent leaves and sweet sap of the sunflowers. They ignored the corn. They swarmed the yellow flowers, covering the stalks, the leaves, the giant, heavy heads in a shimmering, writhing blanket of green. The sunflowers, her ridiculous, glorious weeds, had become a sacrifice. They were the trap crop. They were dying to save the grain. The trap was sprung. The sunflowers, which had been a vibrant wall of yellow and green, were now coated in a pulsing, obscene layer of aphids. The sheer mass of insects bent the stalks, their collective weight a burden the plants could not bear. The humming was a high, frantic thrum of consumption. But then came the second act of the play her father had scripted. From beneath the leaves, from the crevices of the stalks, from the very heart of the flowers, the defenders emerged. The ladybugs, not the dozen or so you might see in a normal garden, but an army. They were the descendants of the cocoons Mrs. Petrova had given her, a population that had been breeding and multiplying all summer, feasting on stray mites and pollen, waiting. Now their banquet had arrived. A tide of red and black armor surged over the green tide of the aphids. It was a silent, brutal war fought on 1,000 fronts. The ladybugs were voracious, efficient killing machines, their mandibles working without pause. Each one could consume 50 aphids a day, and there were tens of thousands of them. The sunflowers had become a buffet, and the aphids were the only thing on the menu. The corn, nestled in its protected corridors, remained an oasis of calm. Not a single aphid touched it. The air in the corn rows was still and sweet, smelling of pollen and damp earth, while just feet away, a massacre was taking place. By the time Thorn and the other men arrived, their own fields lost, the battle on Elspeth's farm was already turning. They stood at the fence line, their faces slack with a stunned, profound disbelief. They had come to see her ruin, the final, predictable punchline to the joke of the Sun Witch. Instead, they were witnessing a miracle. They saw the aphid cloud devouring itself on her sunflowers. They saw the shimmer of ladybugs, a protective shield of living jewels. And they saw her corn, green and tall and utterly, impossibly safe. Thorn leaned his forehead against the rough wood of the fence post, his shoulders shaking. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a hollowed-out awe. He looked at his own fields, a blackened wasteland, and then at hers, an island of life. The arithmetic of his world had been turned upside down. His straight rows and modern methods had led to ruin. Her foolishness, her father's madness, had led to salvation. How? He whispered again, but this time it was not a question for God. He looked at Elspeth, who stood with Finn by her side, watching the strange, terrible beauty of it all. He was seeing her for the first time, not as a grieving girl or a fool, but as someone who had listened to a different kind of wisdom, a wisdom the rest of them had forgotten how to hear. The mockery of the past 3 months curdled in their throats, turning to the ash of shame. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. But the proof was there, humming and chewing and dying in front of them. It was not a theory. It was a harvest, and it was the only one the valley had left. The plague passed in 2 days, leaving a wake of devastation. The valley, which had been a patchwork of greens and golds, was now a uniform, scorched brown. The air stank of rot. The silence of the fields was the silence of death. Only one farm remained an island of green. Elspeth's 80 acres. The sunflowers were ravaged, their heads blackened and drooping, their leaves tattered. But they had done their job. The corn was pristine. The crisis inverted every fortune. The men who had been the pillars of the community, their wealth measured in acres and bushels, were now facing ruin. They had nothing. No crop to sell, no seed for the following spring, no food to put by for winter. Jedediah Thorne was the first to come to her. He didn't send a hand or his wife. He came himself, walking across the blighted fields that separated their properties. He stopped at her gate, his hat in his hands, his face aged a decade in 2 days. "Elspeth," he said, his voice rough. He couldn't meet her eyes. I was wrong. What I said about your father. About you. It was ignorance. It was pride." He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, broken humility. "We're ruined." All of us, behind him, other farmers gathered, their faces grim. They were a silent chorus of desperation. That same afternoon, Mr. Brand's polished buggy reappeared, moving fast along the dusty road. He had heard the news. He saw the ruin everywhere, and he saw the oasis of her farm. Greed glittered in his eyes. This was an opportunity greater than he could have imagined. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Miss Thorne," he said, pulling up his horse.